you go to school? And who's your dad?
What do you think of what's going on right now, mate?
These evil little invisible parasites.
Satan-worshipping Freemason morons.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
We're not run by factions.
Get the fuck out of camera!
There are much more powerful international forces in play.
Is this pink guy? Is this what pink guy is? I don't fucking know what's happening.
Please go outside and look at the moon quickly.
It's been crazy, guys, but guess what? It's how it is, mate.
Mate, because I want to do you slowly.
But I ain't spending any time on it.
Well, g'day, patrons, and welcome. What is it? We've just got a question mark this time, Joel.
You put a question mark on the fucking thing because you can't be bothered looking up. You don't even know the login details of fucking Patreon.
It's a Black Label episode.
It's
but I don't know
25.
what number it is. And it doesn't really matter because this is our special Black Label episode for our patrons, our beloved patrons only. And we can, we're getting, in our Black Label episodes, Joel, we like to get stuck in a way that many people would regard as deeply defamatory and clearly obscene.
Yes.
But because it's for our beloved patrons, we get away with it.
Have at it. Fuck it. Why not? Do it live.
Indeed. Yeah. Now, just before we started recording, I was listening to the Sex Pistols live in concert in 2007 in Brixton. Just some rough heads in the crowd, I got to tell you. It's some rough heads. A lot of piercings. Hell of a lot of piercings. But there they were, the original band, of course, including Glenn Matlock, who got the arse for Sid Vicious. And Glenn Matlock was actually the driving force of the songwriting.
Oh, how unfortunate. But this a pretty boy with a fucking pin through his dick got the spot.
Got the gig. And I was thinking about the wonderful character, the guitarist, who is a really sort of just a warm human being. His name's Steve Jones, the guitarist of Sex Pistols. And he put out a book called Lonely Boy. I'm going to say about 10 years ago now. I think there was a television version of it. It's his account at least, of the Sex Pistols journey. And in that book, he discloses that he was sexually abused by his stepfather.
That's unbelievable.
Steve Jones' father was a boxer. And when you look at Steve Jones' melon, you go, oh, yeah, that's a boxer's melon. He looks a little beat up now at 69, 70. But, yeah, he was subject to sexual abuse by his stepfather. And he claims that's why he's been unable to have any enduring relationships with people, intimate relationships with people over his life. He's never married, and he lives essentially as a single man.
Yeah,
and it's that kind of trauma that would have been raised or re-traumatizing effect when Gerald Ridsdale, Father Gerald Ridsdale, now defrocked, died in jail, aged 90. Now, according to one of his victims, Steve Blacker, who I know well, there is nothing more to be said about the disgraceful life of Gerald Ridsdale. Blacker was 9 years of age when he was raped by Ridsdale in the confession box at St. Colin's Church in Mortlake in 1982. On convictions alone, Ridsdale's victims number more than 70. I think it's almost 80 now. That's just on convictions. And
exactly, yeah.
Excuse me. What you'll find, even last year, there were more. He pleaded guilty to more charges in 2024, and there were, I think, sort of 60 in total that were reduced to a smaller number. So then, when we do look at that figure as just 70 plus number of victims on convictions alone,
it's got to be a fraction.
Those just involved in the actual criminal process.
Yeah.
Would number more than 100, and in reality, the real count would be closer to 1,000. That's 1,000 victims. Now he is on convictions alone is the worst sex offender in Australian criminal history.
Yep.
The fellow up in Queensland who was disgracing himself and traumatising kids up in childcare centres in Queensland and in northern New South Wales. That figure is, the figure that he's been charged with, and I believe the number of charges have been reduced in his case too. That would, once his convictions go through, that will mean that he he will probably be the new leader there. But Ridsdale is the worst sex offender of any type, not just pedophilia, any type, with more than 70 victims, and the real count probably as high as 1,000. It wasn't just in Western Victoria, although he abused many, many children there in the Ballarat diocese, which takes up most of Western Victoria, but also in Sydney, and where the Bishop of Ballarat, Ronald Mulcairn, sent him on one occasion. Another occasion, he was sent to New Mexico for treatment, for psychological treatment.
Yeah, all right.
In one of these weird Roman Catholic, what would you call it, retreats that they had for offending priests. And he offended there. Got out on the weekend and offended there. So the question is, how is this monster created? And I know a lot of people have mentioned the name Cardinal George Pell, and they'll be right to a point, but we'll get to that.
Okay.
I want to talk about another way of looking at this, because you have to ask, how was he allowed to commit offences against children for more than 30 years? Where are we going? From 1960s, really, he was charged for the first time in 1993, so more than 30 years. So here's one thing that people won't know a lot about in terms of Ridsdale's appalling behaviour. In 1975, in the Victorian town of Inglewood, which is about 45 kilometres northwest of Bendigo, he was the parish priest at the time. He might have been an assistant to the parish priest at the time, if memory serves. And adults, parents came forward and notified or made complaints against Ridsdale to the local police office, to the local police station. And the senior police officer in the town didn't charge him, but made a representation to Ronald Mulcairn, the Bishop of Ballarat, to have the priest removed from the parish. And that's duly what happened. And that practice would become the norm. So people are entitled to ask, had he been charged in 1975, would they have been spared? Would these hundreds and hundreds of victims subsequent to that had been spared if the police did what they were supposed to do?
Yeah.
And one victim who cannot be named told me, a number of years ago, that he was raped by Ridsdale in the confines of his own home in Mortlake. He was raped in his own bedroom. Ridsdale tied himself up and then drove the 50-kilometre trip to Warrnambool, where he administered the last rites to the victim's father.
That's right.
Who was seriously ill with cancer. I mean, that speaks of an evil that is, beyond human comprehension.
Yeah.
But also of an offender whose perversity had no limits. I mean, those are obvious things. But the most important thing is he had no expectation of consequence. He had no expectation of being pulled up by police. Because every time he'd sail close to the wind before he got to Mortlake, and he got to Mortlake in 1981, he was there for little more than a year, he'd just been shuffled onto pastures new, whether police were involved or not.
With money, you're going to move on. Here's some money for relocation.
So the story of the boy who was raped in his bedroom in Mortlake sometime in 1981 is a broader story there, because he was the second of three brothers in the family. The eldest boy had also been raped by Ridsdale. So the eldest boys were in 16. This young boy's 15. And he's got a younger brother who's 12. Now, the 12-year-old brother, he was subject to indignity, sexual assaults, acts of gross indecency, but not penetrative rape. And several years later, the boy's mother learned of these crimes perpetrated against her three children, and plucky lady that she was, feisty lady that she was, a lot of parents ignored this stuff, right? She rang up the Victoria Police Force Sex Crimes Unit in Melbourne, and in 1985, detectives drove up from Melbourne and visited the home and took statements from her and the three boys. Now, the youngest boy's allegations were the subject, in part, of Ridsdale's first appearance before the courts, and that was in 1993. He was charged with 30 counts of indecent assault against the youngest brother and 8 other victims aged between 12 and 16. And Ridsdale was sentenced to a year in prison with a non-parole period of just 3 months, which is pretty awful in itself.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's just completely inadequate. And that 1993 charge, that is the one where Pell walked arm in arm with Ridsdale into the courtroom and offered a reference about the priest prior to Ridsdale's sentencing. Ridsdale pleaded guilty, of course, as he always has done. And we have that very famous photo of George Pell and Ridsdale walking into court in Melbourne. That was in 1993. Now, so the youngest boy's allegations, without wanting to trivialise that, they weren't as serious as the offences that occurred to the 2 older brothers.
Yeah,
But the 2 brothers' allegations were not acted on. So Ridsdale was not charged with buggery. He was not charged with penetrative rape on that first occasion. Now, almost 30 years later, the middle boy who told me this story, and he is last time I spoke to him, he was a serving police officer. I won't tell you where.
Yeah,
The middle boy contacted Vic Pol's Sano task force, which is established to deal with all of these issues.
Yeah.
And he asked what had happened to his statement and his brother's statement and why the allegations had not led to serious criminal charges. And he was told by Sano, who went out and looked, they conducted an investigation to find out where this statement was. And they could only get back to him and say, we can't find them. They were lost. Right? The older brother's statement had also disappeared. And to their credit, the eldest brother, according to his sibling, was a little bit, shall we say, messed up to want to proceed.
Yeah, okay.
But the middle brother did. And to Sano Task Force's considerable credit, they did pursue the allegations. This fellow did issue a new statement, and that the allegations contained therein became part of another round of convictions for Ridsdale, this time in 2019. That's 38 years since the offences occurred.
Yeah.
Right? And because of the very feisty mother and the 3 kids who were forthcoming, these allegations were first made in 1985. Right?
Yeah.
And not acted on. That's the really serious stuff, and you've got to wonder why.
Yes.
Ridsdale became just the second priest to be charged with child sex offending in Victorian criminal history. The first was the Melbourne priest Father Michael Glennon, who was convicted in 1978 of indecently assaulting a 10-year-old girl, and then followed a whole raft of charges against Glennon, who died in prison. I think in 2016. The Melbourne Archdiocese depicted Glennon as a sort of maverick, as a sort of outsider, reckless sort of person. They quickly laicized him, which is called defrocking.
Yeah.
But the question remains, obviously, why did it take decades for any Catholic cleric to be charged with child sex offending when clearly there was a lot of offending going on?
Uh-huh.
Now, having written the story of Dennis Ryan, a detective in Mildura who sought to charge another pedophile priest and prolific offender, Monsignor John Day, and Dennis lost his job over it, I became certain that the Ballarat Diocese and elements of the Victoria Police Force had colluded in suppressing evidence and failed to bring Day to the courts. And that was in 1972. Ryan's allegations in the book Unholy Trinity were found to be true in the Royal Commission. Vic Pol extended an apology to Dennis, and despite its finding that Dennis, basically the book Unholy Trinity and what Dennis had said in his statement subsequently to the Royal Commission were true. But they were incurious about the role of policing and what was an epidemic of child sex offending. They listened to Dennis, they examined the story, but there was virtually no other inquiries made about police. And there were failures everywhere. Just everywhere. Melbourne, particularly in the Ballarat Diocese. And they just didn't examine them. And I don't know why to this day it's possible that I have heard one theory that the Royal Commission was steered away from examining police by one of the premiers, because when Julia Gillard announced the Royal Commission, she had to consult with the state premiers and territory chief ministers in order to get their cooperation. And
Fair
I'm
enough.
told, it may just be gossip. I don't know. But I am still mystified as to why the Royal Commission didn't examine the role of police, because clearly it was not good enough. And I think that's not just the case in Victoria. I mean, we did a show, conditional release program. We did one with my very good mate, Rob Anderson. And Rob Anderson was abused at Trinity College, or at a camp run by one of the teachers at Trinity Grammar, I should say, in Sydney's West. And when Rob went to report this, the first time, he just basically told to leave.
Yeah.
And by the police, when he went to the police station, there's this incredible sense of inertia about what he was telling them. And then on the second time, they failed him again. They sort of yeah-yeah'd him, and it again came to nothing. Oh, look, we couldn't do it today. There was a robbery in Manly, and we couldn't. So there were failures pretty much across the nation in terms of policing these things, and I suspect there was a multiple failures around clerical child sex offending because of distorted loyalties of certain police and their loyalties to the church rather than the people they're supposed to serve.
Yeah.
Now, another detective, Victorian police detective, and he's a bit of a hero of mine, his name is Detective Colin Ryan, Dennis's namesake, but no relation.
Yeah, okay.
He successfully prosecuted Father Brian Coffey down in Warrnambool Way, and Father Paul David Ryan, who was an absolute fucking nightmare in the 1990s.
Yep.
Just as an aside, Colin Ryan had the balls, when no one else would, to get a search warrant and go to the Ballarat Diocese offices and say, "Here's a search warrant. I want to go through all your personnel files.
Get it done."
And they all shit themselves, and they handed over files on Paul David Ryan and others. So well done, Colin Ryan, who did, as I say, successfully prosecute Coffey and Paul David Ryan. But he told me that he would never send evidence, any sort of primary evidence of an investigation into clerical pedophilia, to VicPol's Melbourne squads or its senior officers, because you just thought, well, they would just disappear, as we saw with the 15-year-old victim of Ridsdale in Mortlake in 1982, reported in 1985.
Fucked.
So finally, I must disagree with Steve Blacker, who's become a friend of mine over the years. We stay in contact fairly closely. He's a good man. I'm not sure that you'll see him on Twitter much these days, or X, but he used to call himself the real Mr. Cricket. He's a very, very good country cricketer. And he also curates the wicket for one of the country town sides, and loves his cricket, loves his harness racing and all that sort of stuff. He's become a very good mate of mine over the years. But I have to disagree with him when he says there's not a lot more to be said about Gerald Ridsdale. I think there is much more to be said about the role of the Ballarat Diocese, people like Pell, Ronald Mulkerns, all both now deceased, and why Ridsdale was shuffled from parish to parish and onto new groups of victims. There is more to be said about those members of the Victoria Police Force who failed their communities and whose inaction or downright corruption permitted clerical pedophilia to flourish. There is more to be said of the role of institutions, not just the Catholic Church, but other religious institutions, educational institutions, sporting and cultural, all who fail to protect children in their care. And there is more to be said for the state of Victoria, who is only now peering into the morass of historical offending in state schools, where hundreds of children were subject to indignities, and where the offenders, their teachers, were quietly moved along to new schools and new victims. Same MO as the Catholic Church. And now, when I look at this, I go, 100 victims there, 100 victims there, 200 there. around the Victorian state system. That is, senior bureaucrats within the education department would do exactly what Mulcairns and the Royal Commission subsequently found George Pell did. These senior bureaucrats did exactly the same thing. They would become aware of complaints made by parents, and then they would move the teacher on. Generally speaking, into regional Victoria, where presumably it was far enough away, out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, far enough away from what?
So just fucking outrageous negligence, and that's within the state system. So, and I guess finally we also have to say there is more to be said about us as a nation, who in that time, that sort of post-war period, 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and onwards. Why did we hold the lives of our children, our future, really? Why do we hold the lives of our children so cheap?
Yeah.
Look, Steve Blacker was battling with a confusion of emotions when I contacted him on the day Ridsdale departed this earth.
Mm-hmm.
He blames the Catholic Church and the Ballarat Diocese. He and I have discussed the role of policing. He didn't mention that in his statement, but he blamed the Catholic Church and the Ballarat Diocese in particular for their failures and for the almost endless frustrations it subjects the victims to. So if you're a claimant, as Steve was, they'll just drag it out. They'll drag it out in the hope that you die.
Yeah.
Or just get sick of it and accept some much smaller settlement. So they play a dead battle all the time. But he did say in his statement something, and I just want to leave it with our patrons. It's actually a magnificent paragraph, so I'll just read it to you. This is from Steve Blacker, victim of Gerald Ridsdale, one of hundreds of victims of Gerald Ridsdale. He said, his passing will give survivors little joy other than to know he will never offend again. But in reality, that threat ceased decades ago. Won't stop the nightmares or flashbacks. Nothing does. The only victims who have escaped that fate are no longer with us. Things just got too much for them. I know these heavy thoughts. My thoughts are with them. They often are. I wish they could have hung on just a bit longer. But it was a bit too much for some people, as Steve said. It's a terrible thing to subject a child to.
Yeah.
So Ridsdale's gone, and everyone has said, good fucking riddance. And there's a certain point to be made there, Joel.
Sure.
Except to say that the High Court recently, I think last year, brought down a finding in regard to another claimant. This was a claimant of Brian Coffey's, by the way, who we mentioned earlier, another priest in the Ballarat Diocese, who, as other claimants have done, sought to sue the current Bishop of Ballarat, Bishop Bird, and the High Court found that the vicarious liability did not extend to the institution after the death of the offender. So anyone who hasn't put forward a claim, a litigated claim against the diocese, which clearly knew that Ridsdale was offending, whether it's Mulcairns or Pell or any of the other simps that they had running around there at the time, you've got really no hope of proceeding with a litigated claim. You might be able to go to the National Redress Scheme. But, so the death of Ridsdale means the end of claims. And I was speaking to Steve off the record, I suppose. I'm not sure that I should be saying this, but I said to him, the diocese, and we refer to the diocese, that's the bishop and all those who sail with him, would be rubbing their hands together at the thought that Ridsdale was dead, because that means no big payouts anymore.
It's all about money.
Yeah, so I guess you want to talk about George Pell. We'll talk about it very briefly, and people say, well, George Pell knew about this. He was a relatively junior priest at the time when this offending was taking place.
Yeah.
The Royal Commission found that he knew, and I have no doubt that they're right.
Yeah.
What Pell did, and I'm not trying to excuse it, was exactly what leaders or senior people in institutions did, whether it was the Catholic schools, Anglican schools, sporting associations, social groups, theatre groups, these sorts of things. The Catholic Church did exactly, or the leadership of the Ballarat diocese did exactly what everyone else has done.
Yeah.
And continues to do, by the way.
Yeah, okay.
We need to get really need to toughen up these reporting laws. So when, and I know Lou Milligan's written a story for Conversation. It's actually been taken off the shelves, where she interviews a number of Pell's victims.
Yeah, okay.
I know who those people are, and I'm not going to address that, other than to say, if police acted, just push Pell to one side. It's quite an easy thing to do when you want to, right? Just push him to one side and say, had police acted properly in 1975 in Ingleburn, in 1972 in Mildura, in 1993 or 1985 in Mortlake, in 1993, I mean, the failures are everywhere.
Yeah. Had
the police acted, Ridsdale gets locked up. That's the end of his offending, at least, right?
That's it.
He gets laicized by agreement. He gets thrown out of the church, and all his power is gone. The other thing I want to talk about, because people often say this, why is there so much offending within the Catholic Church? And they talk about, vows of chastity that priests undertake.
Yeah, it doesn't.
As if that might be a reason. That a young man like Ridsdale would have entered a seminary and he did at 17 years of age, and that when he enters that seminary, the theory goes his psychosexual development ends there or freezes there.
Okay.
And he maintains he may well have been gay. This is part of the thing, part of the theory. As a young emerging gay man, and with his psychosexual development frozen, he continues to look at 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old boys.
Yeah, okay. Very Michael Jackson sort of vibes.
Doesn't explain the rape of 9-year-old kids. It just doesn't.
Hiding their fucking jumper? Are you serious?
These guys did it because they fucking could. Because they could.
And the frock got them in the door.
Speaks to that power imbalance.
Yeah.
That's why they did it. Because not only because they held power over these people in country towns where the church was the ultimate authority,
exactly,
and an expression for people's family and friends and so forth. So when you take the church on, it's a big undertaking. 1975, you do this, you're going to get slaughtered.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a terrible, terrible thing, and we really should never lose sight of the fact that we, as a society, as a country, as a nation, lost sight of what's really valuable, and that our children just weren't properly protected. I believe it's a lot better now, and I know policing's a lot better. Might not be perfect, but it's a lot better. But had police acted properly at the time, much of this sorrow would not have occurred.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that, I'm afraid. All right. Pretty grim stuff, but we needed to deal with Gerald Ridsdale, and while everyone says good riddance, it's a mixed bag, particularly for those who haven't yet come forward and who might choose to litigate through the courts for compensation.
Yeah,
they virtually stand no chance now.
No problem.
All right.
That's not fair.
Meanwhile, another Catholic, as it turns out.
Well, yeah.
I think he certainly was raised as one.
Raised a Catholic, yeah.
Bobby Kennedy Jr. I'm not sure that even we could blame Catholicism for Bobby Kennedy Jr.
No, we really can blame Bobby for Bobby. Bobby is Bobby's problem.
And yes, he is. And I think where we're going with this, Joel, is that he's taken a dislike. Well, he's held a long dislike, but now he's in a position of authority to people taking antidepressants, Joel.
Yes. So I'm just going to point out to introduce this something that's really fucking obvious, that there is one thing that we know, because we don't know a lot. There's one thing we do know about RFK Jr., and that is that his relationship with the truth is loose.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, look, this is a lawyer thing, right? You know, how do you know Bobby's lying? His lips are moving. The old lawyer joke.
Indeed.
Very funny. But he's also croaking out some feeble excuse for his sentence, which will be intentionally contradicted by his actions as quick as you can say, dead kids in Samoa. And he'll be like,
83 of them, to be exact.
I didn't. Well, that's 83 that you know of, Jack. 83 you know of. So
Well, that's the
official count.
formal death count. I think almost all of them were children under the age of under 10.
I'd
There
love
might
to
have been
see
a few
some
teens.
economist do the math on how many children RFK Jr. has killed. But anyway.